everybody. My name is Rhonda Henricks, and I work with the North Point Partner Team here in Atlanta. And I'm super excited to be with you today to share with you a little bit about gaining, training, and retaining volunteers, something we all are probably struggling with a little bit and excited to learn more about in this season of ministry. As we get started, I just want to introduce myself. As I mentioned, my name is Rhonda, and I've been here at North Point for about 7 years. I've been on the partner team here for about 4 years, and prior to that was the guest experience director at North Point Community Church for actually about 4 years there as well. And then prior to that, I was actually at one of our partner churches out in Colorado Springs, and I was on staff there for about 6 years leading the guest experience teams, as well as doing a bunch of things that we called ministry services, which is really just administration and all the kind of behind the scenes things that happen in a church. So with that, I'd love to just dive in today and just share some ideas and some learnings that we've been having with some of our partner churches around the globe about how to gain, train, and retain volunteers. As we do that, I'm going to share my screen here with you. And here we go. Yes. And really, again, we're just going to be talking about this idea. And, you know, when we talk about, when we think about this last season of how difficult it's been in leadership at churches, and we have, you know, we've been through one of the hardest seasons, and coming out of that, as if gaining, training, and retaining volunteers wasn't difficult before, it has become even more difficult after the pandemic and throughout the season. So I don't know about you, but if you've been feeling the tension of what do we do and how do we do this, so are we. You're not alone. So let's just share some ideas about how we can probably do that. And, you know, honestly, better than ever, more than ever, we need to pull out all the stops and be as creative as possible to figure out how do we do this. So I'm just going to share a few ideas. You'll be able to see these on my screen, but I'm going to talk through a few of them. Recruiting rewards is kind of an interesting idea in terms of, I know one of our churches has like a recruiting jar, and they actually said, like, for every person that you recruit, drop your name in this jar, and like once a month or something like that, they might do a giveaway of a maybe an Amazon gift card or something fun, just to kind of reward volunteers for kind of helping us to recruit additional volunteers. Obviously, friends inviting friends, that's nothing new. We've been doing that for throughout the ages, right? Our volunteers are the best recruiters of our next volunteers because they love what they're doing. Utilizing groups. I love this one, is like really partnering with your groups director to figure out who are the people that are in group and yet not serving, and how do we go to those group leaders and say, hey, what if we cast a vision to these groups to possibly even just to serve as a group, or possibly even just casting the vision to the group members and saying, hey, if you haven't joined in and volunteering, this is a great place to jump in. Volunteer, that's a great opportunity just to say, like, hey, we just want to give you a tour of behind the scenes at our church. Like, come and take a look and see what it's all about, and just have like a time after your church where you can walk people through the different environments and they can see what happens there and just get a feel for it. Maybe they don't have a child in, say, your elementary program, so they haven't actually been in that environment themselves, but for them to see it and see the vision behind it and what you're trying to do can actually energize some people to say, sign me up. The sneak peek, I love this one because it's actually kind of a behind the scene curtain look into, like, hey, why don't you, and it kind of goes with this taste and see idea of like, what would it look like to say, hey, let me give you a glimpse of what it looks like to volunteer. We would love for you to taste and see. And the taste and see idea is really this idea of, why don't you come and join us for just a small period of time? Give them like 2 weeks. Maybe it's 2 weeks over the summer, or maybe it's 2 weeks to kick off your fall season, or maybe it's 2 weeks around Christmas or Easter, but find a time where you just say, hey, we are just asking you to sign up for 2 weeks, and then have an intentional plan to follow up with those people at the end of those 2 weeks to find out, how did it go? And would they be willing to jump in and serve with you? Obviously, lots of churches do this, but church-wide serving campaigns at North Point, you'll see this little logo down at the bottom. We had a whole campaign a few years ago all around difference maker. We created t-shirts that looked like this. And what we did is we had everybody who was volunteering, whether they were actually volunteering that Sunday or not, but if they were on any volunteer team, we said, wear your difference maker t-shirt today. And we provided them and handed them out. And what it really did was create this overall sense of, oh, how do I get one of those? And how do I get on that team? And very quickly they saw the number of people, the volume of people that were serving on the teams. And a lot of people stepped up and said, hey, how can I be a part of that? We also created some videos around the difference maker idea. And we had a couple of key volunteers just highlighting their story of what they were thinking before they volunteered, maybe some of their fears, and we addressed those on video, and then we were able to cast that to the church and to recruit some more volunteers. Along those same ideas, a couple of other ideas that we've done like the best day ever. We wanted to say like, we actually threw basically a party and created this idea of like, hey, serving the days that you serve is the best day ever. And also that follows with kind of the I Love Sundays, in which we actually created like a ice cream sundae bar out in the lobby and had an opportunity for people to make their own sundae. But the whole idea around that was I love Sundays and I would want to be a part of those. So here's some other ideas in terms of segmenting messaging. I actually think this is a super important tactic that all churches ought to be using these days. And that's really like figuring out, how do you communicate differently to those who maybe once volunteered, but maybe have decided that they're not ready to come back. So maybe I know a lot of our churches, we went ahead and surveyed our volunteers early on and kind of tried to feel them out. Like, where are you in the process of like, hey, I am not coming back until vaccines are out, or I'm not coming back until masks are not required, or I'm not coming back until whatever their reason. Or maybe there was even a group of people that said, I'm ready to come back right now. And we began to place those people in different kind of segments. And we began to communicate differently to each one of those segments, so that we weren't trying to get volunteers who said, hey, I'm not ready to come back, and trying to send them a message every single week about, hey, here's another serving opportunity, when they already communicated to us that they weren't ready. So really think through your segmented messaging that way. Student impact, we love this one around at North Point. We actually intentionally have our student environment housed, or they actually meet on Sunday evenings. And part of why we do that is we want to give them the opportunity to serve. But student impact is really about making a direct and intentional ask to your students to say, hey, would you be willing to step up and help lead in an environment that of younger, either children or students, or maybe even join a guest experience team to say, how can I empower and include our students in the ministry that we're doing on Sunday mornings? The leader asked, this one's nothing new, but going around to all of your leaders and your staff and saying, hey, could everybody write down one name? Just give us one name on this piece of paper of somebody that we could ask to say, we would love to, we'll do the work, but if you'll just give us the one name, then we'll know who to go towards and invite to specifically serve, maybe on a specific team, or, just kind of going through and saying like, hey, would you be willing, somebody gave us your name saying you'd be a great volunteer, would you consider joining us? The circle back idea is really going back to the people who maybe stopped serving even 2 or 3 years ago, and just circling back to them to find out, hey, would you be ready to come back? We have this idea of, and casting vision around more than ever, we need to create churches that unchurched people would love to attend, because we have a mission to do and invite them into that mission. And maybe they stopped serving for a couple of years ago for a variety of different reasons, but maybe, just maybe, they're ready to come back. And if they know that they're thought of in that way, they're maybe more likely to take a step and come back and say, I do miss that. Let me be a part of that solution. The giving database is very similar to working with your groups director, but maybe working with your finance director and saying, hey, I don't need to know the details of who's serving or who's giving, but is there a way to say, what's the group of people? Could we create a segment of people that are giving financially to our church and to our mission, but maybe are not volunteering? And is there a way to make a direct ask to those people? Because if they're already giving, it's likely that they're pretty bought into the mission and vision of the church. And maybe they just haven't found their place of serving, and maybe they just haven't been directly asked. So what would it look like to team up with your finance director to say, hey, could I get a list of this segment, and then speak to them directly? And if you know they're giving and not serving, how can you craft your message specifically to that group to maybe compel them to take a step to serving? Another idea is combining teams. This one is, an unusual maybe one, but one that we have an opportunity to do because of COVID and because of the situation and season that we've just come through. And it's a really great way to take a hard look at our teams and say, are there some places where we could share some responsibilities or join some teams together to create the size team that we actually need, or possibly even taking maybe a rotation that maybe, let's say you have volunteers working once a month, like maybe there's a team that's working every month. Could you combine those teams to say, hey, we would actually like to change your interval to every other week or something like that, and actually have them work a little bit more often, or combining responsibilities so you just don't need two teams. So really taking a 50,000 foot view of your volunteer teams and their responsibilities, and really trying to look at that and saying, how could we join forces on some responsibilities to create additional opportunities and needing less volunteers. This next page is great. I think lead pastor videos, this one I actually love because I think it's an opportunity to ask and partner with your lead pastor to say, hey, would you create on your phone? It doesn't have to be polished. It doesn't have to be high def, but could you just take 30 seconds on your phone and cast a compelling vision for why volunteer here? Why come and be a part of this? And then as a leader of an environment, I could use that video from my lead pastor to send out to different groups of people. And having the lead pastor making the ask can sometimes be a really great way. And then, of course, there's social media. And it's really, here's just 3 examples of some of our partner churches who do a really great job of saying, hey, let me highlight one of our volunteers and figure out a way to leverage their story to be an inspiration to others. And of course, always having a link in the bio of how to serve and how to be a part of it. And this is something that is just becomes a culture. You can even see one of them even uses culture builder, but it becomes a culture builder of your church when it becomes a part of what you're going to recognize. It's one of those ideas of what's rewarded is repeated. And so when people begin to see on your social media that you are highlighting or elevating the role of the volunteer, it gives them a privilege and an insight into what we value. And it really gives them an opportunity to say, hey, wouldn't you want to join this team as well? And then possibly my absolute favorite idea, and I'm going to say it's my favorite idea, and yet I have just begun to see this starting to happen. If you've ever heard about the idea of this Instagram influencers, and this is where like big companies will almost hire various people who have a large following and say, hey, will you open my box or open this thing or talk about my product on your social media channels? And by doing so, they're influencing their peers and the people that are following them to actually take a step or to purchase that product. How could the church leverage this idea? I actually absolutely love this idea, and I would love to see a church figure this out. So I've just started seeing my first, I've been talking about this for a few months with the various churches that I've been working with, and I just have first started seeing my first glimpses of this happening for the church. Now, how do you do this? I don't know. I'll be honest. I haven't done this myself, but I think there's something to this. And I think when we're going to think about how does culture respond to things in today's day and age, that's one of the things I think we should be thinking about. It may take us empowering and embodying the ideas of the next generation, which I think is a fabulous idea, but figuring out who is it within your congregation that has a lot of influence and possibly has a lot of followers, maybe more than one person. This might be 5 or 10 people that you could bring in and become your influencers. And how could you leverage their platforms and the influence they already have to actually help the church and grow your volunteer teams? I think there's a huge opportunity here, and I can't wait to see people actually figure this out. And by the way, if your church is doing this well, I would love you to send me an email or figure out a way to get that information over to the partner team, because I'd love to see it. I'd love to highlight it, and I'd love to possibly even interview on it. So anyway, that's just a fun idea that I am passionate about right now. All right, then you get into training. This one is always an interesting thing to me, because most of our volunteer roles, volunteers, they feel like they need a little training to get started, but then past that, they're like, I don't need to come in for another training. But you and I know as leaders in the church that it's never a once and done experience. Like ongoing training needs to happen. So training in my mind is never about a course or something you attend. It needs to be embedded into all of the vision and every single Sunday and anytime you can be in front of your volunteers, how can you lead with a sense of maybe values and not rules and things like that? I believe that the best training starts strong and then continues to drip over time. What's interesting is that no one ever wants to spend their Saturday at a volunteer training, and yet churches routinely set up trainings on weekends or evenings that people are like, we've got 1,500 other things that could be vying for our time. To go to a volunteer training doesn't sound that all that appealing. The other thing that is not my favorite thing about how some churches do volunteer training is they say, we're going to have an appreciation event. But really, when they get there, it's almost like a bait and switch. And they're like, the volunteer learns very quickly, like, oh, this wasn't really about appreciating me. This was actually about a training that I probably wouldn't have come to if I knew it was training. So we have to be pretty, I guess, almost kind of figure out what are the best ways to drip in training every time I'm in front of my volunteers. How do I continually put these ideas in front of them? So I really love this idea, as I actually am a full-on believer that you should lead out of a set of values and not rules. And here's what I mean by that. Southwest Airlines had a principle where they were like, how do we empower the people at the very front lines of our organization to make decisions? And so they decided to lead out of a set of values and not rules. And their 3 values were they want to make their customers happy, they want on-time departures, and that they don't want the decision to cost the organization anymore. They're a very lean airline. And so in order to keep their prices low, they had to keep their expenses low. So they would lead out of those 3 values: make the customer happy, on-time departures, and being cost conscious. So the thing that they did is when they empowered people with those 3 values, at every gate and at every interval, the people were able to make decisions at that level without saying, let me call my manager or send them down to customer service. They were actually asked and enabled and empowered to make those decisions. Now, here's what that looked like. So if somebody showed up at the airport, maybe early, and there happened to be another flight going the same direction to where they were headed, and a guest came up to the gate and said, hey, is there any chance that I could get on this flight instead of the one in 3 hours? Now, in a lot of airlines, they send them down the hall, go to customer service, stand in line, tell them your story, pay $100, and then come. And then if they grant you that wish, you can come back and get on this flight. Well, at Southwest, they said, let's empower the gate agent to say, hey, do you have a seat? If the answer is yes, would this make my customer happy? Yes. Can we still have an on-time departure? Yes. And will this cost our organization anything more if this guest gets on this flight versus the one in 3 hours? If the answer is no, then by all means, here's your ticket. Yes, get on this flight, and everyone's happy. So you can kind of start to see, as we're beginning to think about values, if we're leading through a set of values, what does that look like? Here at North Point, we have 3 values that we tried to use. We said we're going to prioritize the guest, anticipate their needs, and remove obstacles. So when we begin to say that those are the 3 values that are going to drive all of our decisions as volunteers, now we've empowered our volunteers to say, at every interval, at every door, at every parking space, at every children's check-in area, how do I prioritize the guest that's in front of me, anticipate their needs? So I've thought about what are they going to need when they come in, and I've thought about the system that can support them. And then I'm going to remove their obstacles. What are those obstacles? Too long of lines? Did the system work? Am I frustrated by the system of parking the cars out in the parking lot? Whatever the systems are, have we removed obstacles, anticipated people's needs, and prioritized the guest? And if we're leading out of that set of values, rather than a set of do's and don'ts, we are actually training our volunteers with a story around those values every single time. All right, so let's move on. Clearly communicate the win. We here at North Point, we wrote a 1-sentence job description for every single volunteer role. We wanted you to know, as a greeter or as a parking attendant or as a usher, you had one job. And the win, how do you go home every day knowing if you did your job well? You had a 1-sentence job description. So I would encourage you to think through, what is the win of every single role, and do the people know it? Are you reiterating that win and over communicating with clarity over time so that it just gets embedded into them and they're like, got it. I know exactly what I'm supposed to do and how to win here. Um, let's see. I love this one. The celebrate expressions of the values every chance you get. So what we all know is what's rewarded is repeated. And so we want to figure out when we see a volunteer actually living out the value that we are trying to communicate and get through, we're going to take that story and we're going to highlight it. We're going to blast it out in any way we can, whether that's social media, in an email, maybe even a volunteer vision piece. But we want to highlight the what the person did, as well as who did it. And we want to basically celebrate that publicly, because what's rewarded gets repeated, and everyone begins to realize like, that's the center of the target. All right, we're going to also say, make the training easy, obvious, and strategic. That might seem obvious to you, easy, obvious, strategic, but run everything that you do through that lens. Is your training easy? Is it obvious what their next step is to do as a volunteer? And is it strategic? Does it actually move the volunteer towards, in terms of training, towards the end goal or that win that you've already communicated to them? So always thinking through, what does that look like? Also on that, it's like making sure that your interval between somebody asking, hey, I'm ready to volunteer, and them actually getting on a volunteer team, that process needs to also be easy, obvious, and strategic. It's got to move them forward and move them forward quickly. Because if too much time goes by between them raising their hand and saying, I'm interested, and you getting them actively involved in a team, if that goes too long, you've lost your window for that volunteer, and they have found something else to plug into their time to volunteer or to take up their time in some other way. This last one I love. It's ensuring that your volunteer training is memorable, meaningful, and motivational. Don't waste their time is basically the bottom line. The stories that you tell are the things that they're going to remember, and that they're going to be able to convert into strategy, and that they're the things that will inspire your volunteers to continue serving in your churches, and to actually even to recruit additional volunteers. So what is it you want them to remember most? Remember, they won't remember everything. So figure out what's the bottom line. What's the one thing when you're communicating to them that you want them to remember now, and make sure that it's tied to something like an emotion of some sort, laughter, tenderness, or something that even makes the hair on their arm stand up. When something becomes, ties an emotion to it, they are more apt to remember that story and to actually convert that into, wow, I would love to be a part. I would love to be used by God to have one of those stories as well. So the next question is, now you've got them there, how do you retain them? And this is, especially a tricky thing during, post the season that we've just been in. So I'm just going to start off with like creating systems that support your volunteers. For example, what do they do with their kids when they show up to volunteer? Oftentimes we need our volunteers to be in place way before the guests begin to show up. So what do they do with their kids? Have we created a system that supports the volunteers that we're trying to get in to take on the mission of our church? What can we do? How can we save them some time? Could we provide them a light breakfast? All the different things. Like, how do we save them time and say, hey, we so value you being here that we want to save you time. We have breakfast for you. Don't worry about your kids. We've already thought about that. And also, when you come in, work, and you staying organized, to me, is one of the things that supports your volunteers. When somebody walks into a room of chaos or disorganization, all of a sudden they're like, I don't know that they were ready for me. But when things have order and a place and a way, I, as a volunteer now, when I walk into a room, I'm like, oh, they were prepared for me. They were waiting for me. They anticipated my own needs, and they actually created a system and a flow that supported my job as a volunteer and made it, again, easy for me to say yes to a volunteer role. And then I would just ask you, do you have the right leaders in place? Again, I'll go back to what I just said a few minutes ago. Your leaders are going to be the ones that are going to move that curve to right and tight. And again, your volunteers are rarely going to surpass the enthusiasm of the leaders in place. So this goes from like, who did you hire, as well as who are the volunteer leaders that are overseeing certain teams. So making sure that you have the right leaders in place that, and I love to say too, like, can they lead and can they follow? And there's so much behind that. That could be a whole nother podcast, but we'll just leave it there for now. And then also, do they understand how the role that they plays a part in in your overall mission as a church? And again, that kind of goes back to defining their win and helping the volunteers and the leaders understand what their win is and absolutely making sure that they get there. All right, so using clear and compelling communication. We all know this, right? Clarity, clarity, clarity. Clear and compelling communication. You might think you've said this 5 times. The volunteer maybe heard it once. So you may have to say the same thing over and over again and in a new compelling way, maybe with an illustration. Different people learn and hear things different ways. So we as leaders have to be creative in how are we going to get the vision across? And that's by using that clear and compelling communication. And, telling stories, inspiring people, and telling them exactly what that win is. And then removing barriers. What do you think? Have you ever stopped and asked the question, what in your organization is stopping people from volunteering? And that's a question that I'm going to actually send to your groups when we're done with this presentation. I'd love for you to just think about that. What is it in your church or in your systems that is currently stopping people from actually volunteering? So think about what are the barriers that you have, and then how can you remove those? The next one there is making your volunteers feel known and needed. This is super huge. If volunteers show up and they're like, gosh, there really wasn't a spot for me, or they didn't really need me, then all of a sudden, next time it's their turn to volunteer, they're going to be like, I don't really kind of feel like going. And last time I came in, I wasn't needed. So why bother? The other thing is if they show up week after week after week and no one talks to them or knows their name, they can lose heart pretty quickly and say, not really valued here. So helping your volunteers feel known and needed is a super, super important idea. And along with that, it's asking the right volunteers for their input on important decisions. You begin to create buy-in and ownership when you ask the right people the right questions and allowing their voice to be heard, even if their voice did not equate to a vote. It's super important to giving them voice into the decisions that are being made. This next one I think is super important, and some of us love to hold all the ministry tight. And so I'm going to ask you to open your hands and give meaningful ministry away, not just the tasks of ministry, but actually giving meaningful ministry away. How can we empower our volunteers for frontline ministry and the ministry and the work of the church? And that's everything from being willing to pray with someone to meeting a need, maybe even empowering them to say, hey, go ahead and actually meet that need in a certain way. And that might look different in every single church. So I'll let you figure out what that actually means. But never make it about the task. Always make volunteering about the people on the other side of the task that you're performing. It's always, always, always about the people. So for example, it's never about holding the door open for someone. If the point was holding a door open, we could get a doorstop to do that. The point is the interaction that we're hoping to happen with the guest. And then elevating the role of the volunteer. We talked about that a little bit earlier in terms of using your social media and other platforms to really elevate the role of the volunteer, but helping them to understand and know that you're creating a volunteer-led culture. Even if you have staff, it's still a volunteer-led culture, and that that's one of our jobs as leaders, honestly, and as staff members, is to figure out how can I create more and more leaders to be a part of this mission, and how can I do that? We cannot accomplish our mission without our volunteers, and I'm going to guess neither can you. And so really just emphasizing this is a volunteer-run organization. Without their help, we absolutely couldn't do it. The other thing that we didn't talk about here, but in terms of training and even retaining, helping people understand that it's never about the transaction that's taking place, whether that's checking your kids in or whatever. It's always the most important thing is not the transaction, it's the interaction. And when volunteers begin to understand the interaction is more important, they begin to take ownership of that and shift their attention from the task at hand to the person in front of them. And to me, that's super important in every single volunteer opportunity. And then lastly, when we're talking about volunteering and retaining volunteers, we cannot go far without appreciation. So figuring out a way of how to appreciate your volunteers is a super important part of your strategy. I fully believe that people will orient themselves towards affirmation more than anything else. So think about that. If people orient themselves around affirmation, and I'm going to guess you and I do too. So how can we appreciate our volunteers? And that's everything from handwritten notes. I know in my role as a guest experience director at North Point, that was a common practice for me to start every Monday writing a minimum of 5 notes to my volunteers. And I would try to seek out on Sunday. Had the eyes and ears for Lord, who do you want me to appreciate this week? And help me to watch and look at my volunteers through those eyes of who's embodying the principles and values that we're trying to uphold here, or who's just doing something above and beyond, and making sure to call them out and appreciate them. And then figuring out a system for appreciation, whether that's something small, something large. But I would say if your budget doesn't have any room in it for appreciation, I would consider advocating to your finance director at least a little bit of money where you could actually have, like, maybe I could send them a gift card. Maybe I could take them for coffee. Could I even just buy some note cards? Or it might even look like, we actually did this random thing where we actually bought these they were cheap, $3 a piece, little awards. And we actually created a system for a whole year of saying once a quarter, we're going to hand out these awards, which really became a fun thing for the volunteers to be able to see that we actually did appreciate what they were doing. And we tried to highlight and appreciate the volunteers who were doing some of the values, and that tied into the story, and the volunteers rallied around it and celebrated the people with us. So it was super, super fun to do that. So don't forget to appreciate your volunteers and find some creative ways. We also have done like annual volunteer appreciation events. That can be a really fun way. And just remember, as I mentioned earlier, there's a very big difference between appreciating your volunteers and a training. So in my mind, I'm not saying I'm right, but in my mind, I really feel like separating the two and finding a way to train outside of an appreciation event is way more important, and making the appreciation event truly all about the volunteer and saying thank you. So finding ways to do that. As I'm sure you're not surprised by, the highest level of guest satisfaction always comes and is found with where the highest levels of volunteer satisfaction is. So as we're considering how do we gain, how do we train, and how do we retain our volunteers, it's super important to remember that we owe it to our volunteers and we owe it to our guests to make sure that we're creating a valuable volunteer experience in our churches. So that was a lot of information to digest. Thanks so much for tracking with me and listening in. We're going to take a few minutes now to divide you up into some smaller groups for some discussion. Thanks for being here today.